IVM.
Welcome to Dreaming with Your Eyes Open. Ronnie Screwvala is an entrepreneur who I have admired for a long time. His ability to make inroads in an industry that is so tightly controlled by so few was what first had me so impressed. When he released his book a few years ago, I lapped it up and was even more impressed. The more I discovered his journey and the various businesses he has been a part of, the deeper my admiration went. When this project came up, I jumped on it. Where else was I going to get the opportunity to spend so much time discussing the ins and outs of his career and what he's accomplished? In this episode, I talked to Ronnie about growing up in a lower middle class family, his thirst for entrepreneurship in college, and how the ability to take calculated risks helped him shape his entrepreneurial journey. Welcome, Ronnie. So this time we're going to talk about the chapter From Grant Road to Breach Candy. This is the first chapter of the book, like first real chapter.
And I think just for geography for everyone, Grant Road to Breach Candy for everyone else in India and outside of Mumbai and outside of India.
I guess it's South Bombay to South Bombay, but slightly less posh South Bombay to slightly
low
more
middle
posh
class
South
to upper middle class.
Okay, all right, sure, if you want to put it that way. But you lived in a nice building in Grant Road as well, right? You said that, I think
Actually, I'd say out of my 18 years that I lived there, 9 of them had those, what you call props.
Oh, really?
Where the buildings are going to collapse and they don't collapse.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, very much so.
I remember the story about you selling tickets for people to watch.
Yes, it was next to Novelty Cinema.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that they're all very, 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 very old and ancient buildings.
Oh, okay. I thought that was, all right, sorry, I misunderstood that.
Yeah, I mean, it was like 4 rooms in a row and 1 toilet at the end.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. I wanted to ask you about this, right? I lived there until the age of 16, privileged enough to go to a school where most of my classmates came in cars while I waited 45 minutes for the BEST bus to arrive. This is something that I've kind of observed over and over again. People who come from backgrounds where they are surrounded by people of extraordinary privilege, but they themselves are somewhat privileged, but not that privileged. Do you think that that is a characteristic, or do you think that that kind of leads to
It can actually work both ways. I think this was just my personal experience. Right. And I think a lot of that has to do, to be honest, with my upbringing and a lot to do with your parents and value systems rather than wealth and disparateness. Because even in your school days, I don't think you feel out of place one way or the other. Yes, you may go disproportionately to somebody else's house because at your place there isn't that kind of privacy,
right,
both for girlfriends and for large parties. But other than that, I would say a lot more of that is to do with your upbringing.
Okay. So moving on from there, I mean, you were talking about at the age of 10, you earned your first round of money, right? So, I mean, again, is that something you see as a characteristic in entrepreneurs just generally, the idea that they start early?
I don't think the badge of honor is one of that you have to start at 10, 11, and 12. And I think...
But do you always think about it?
It could have been easily possible that I still did what I did at 10 years old by charging tickets on the veranda and then gone out and joined a multinational and become a McKinsey consultant.
But do you see this as something that's innate in people when if they're looking at entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think there is a DNA.
Right.
There is definitely a DNA. There are a lot of things about entrepreneurship that you can learn, but the basic DNA of just saying that this is something I want to get out and do, there's a certain sense of DNAs that would need to be there, yeah.
Okay. So you want to talk a little bit about the rock concert that you organized? I think that was a fun thing to read about.
Yeah, I mean, when I think you're at that absolute very, very early stage in school and college and you're looking for pocket money, especially when you're coming from a lower middle class where you're not even getting a decent allowance, right, and yet you're surrounded by a lot of other people, especially the people of the opposite sex who need to be impressed with a little bit more in terms of class. I think you need to look at opportunities. And I think theater for me was a hobby.
Okay.
So we'd earn maybe at that stage 100, 200 rupees on a Friday and then again on Saturday and Sunday. And that was good enough to blow up for the whole weekend and impress somebody. And then I think the material part was also I was getting attracted a little bit to showbiz to a certain extent. And so the rock concert was pretty much that. It was like, this impresario approach, the sort of looking at something and executing on it. Was I pretty fond of that music? Not particularly, but I think that's been my kind of DNA almost all along. I mean, today when we own a kabaddi team and a volleyball team, the first people say, what sport do you play? And I said, I don't play any sport. And maybe I've gotten excited about this is that because I've not played a sport, I can look at this in a very different manner and look at the ecosystem differently. And I think that was pretty much what it was then.
Okay, so you were not into that. You were not into rock music at that time.
I don't think I was into rock music at all. It was about the fun was, wow, it sounds interesting. Let's get 4 bands from 4 different parts of India, put them all together do it at a 3,000 people indoors auditorium at that stage, which in the whole of India was only at the Shanmugananda Hall. And let's see what happens.
You haven't done much in the way of live events outside of the sports that you're doing right now,
as I said, these were just things that you do in school and college, and then that's it.
But events were not something that interested you otherwise?
Not at all.
Yeah?
Not at all.
Okay.
And we lost a pile of money. So in a sense, it was a big failure financially. But as a learning, it was a good experience. As a brand, it was fine. But a brand that I didn't continue didn't make a difference whether I built a brand or not.
Let's move into some of the more kind of business questions rather than the biographical questions, right? You talk about ask anyone for the definition of first-generation entrepreneur, and chances are you'll get a blank stare or a wrong answer. How do you define a first-generation entrepreneur? I mean, you have been doing entrepreneur stuff since you're 10, right?
Yeah, but I think first-generation entrepreneur is pretty much that, because most people in India in entrepreneurship start off because there's a family business.
Okay.
So then you're an entrepreneur because you're a family business.
Right.
And I think differentiating between that and a first-generation entrepreneur is someone who's absolutely started from scratch, number one, and with zero resources, because obviously that means the rest of the family are either in a professional field, and therefore the elasticity for risk and the ability to get initial capital is very low to zero.
Right.
That's really a first-generation entrepreneur.
Okay.
And I think today when everyone does ranking of people, I personally think, you should rank people, in whatever stature you want to, of people who've become successful, and people who've become successful as a first-generation entrepreneur. Because actually, there's an incredibly different challenge when you start off from absolute scratch.
Right. How would you contrast that to people who are not first-generation entrepreneurs, right? I mean,
No, I don't think there's anything bad or wrong on either side. I was just talking about the fact that we need a lot more of them, because I think just the family businesses are not going to take us to the next level of entrepreneurship in this country.
Right. So do you think
because 99 or 98% of those entrepreneurs are not the families that you think of about the industrial houses.
Right.
It's more about the small mom and pop store and whatever else.
Right.
Those people now need to figure out how I'm going to be a real entrepreneur and a first generation entrepreneur, not take over my father's profession or business.
So you would say that when you talk about a first generation entrepreneur, you don't necessarily mean that you're not from an entrepreneurial family, but you're starting something new.
Yes, completely afresh with no resources.
Interesting. I'm going to talk about a couple of quotes here. The first is, this is the one that you started off the chapter with, right? Risk isn't about rushing headlong into uncertain situations. That's just foolish behavior. Risk means pushing the envelope when others want to take the safe route and caring more about potential rewards than possible losses. So you talk about risk in the context of potential loss versus potential reward. Generally, when most people who are from non-entrepreneurship backgrounds, they talk about risk, they only look at the downside. They don't look at the upside. How do you think that, how do you get that to change, right, in people's mindsets?
Yeah, no, I think, there are two R's there anyway. Risk reward is definitely the case. So I think it is good to look at the downside, but I think when you're working with somebody else's money, or you have a professional job where your entire accountability is one where if you don't do too much out of the box, you can still do well as long as you go out and meet your target. Then risk becomes a completely different word, right? Because then you're saying, do I need to step outside my sandbox? So that's one. I think overall, for a lot of people, the context of a downside is a good way to look at that. And I said that's why it's not one of those things where you get up one morning and say, I'm going to take this risk. It's a little bit of a honed-in thought process, right? So calculated risk means you're calculating risk versus reward. Otherwise, what is a calculated risk?
Right.
It's not a calculated risk of how bad your loss will be. It's like it could be a -2 or a +10, or is it a -2 or a +2?
Right.
If it's a -2 or a +2, you might think not worth it, depending on what stage of your life you are in.
Right.
If you're starting at the beginning, a -2 and a +2 may still be fine.
Right.
And as you grow, you want to look at -2 +10.
Right.
Then you consider that to be a calculated risk. And then you need to figure out that should I be doing 2 or 3 of those situations, because 3 -2s and 3 +10s is my probability of success higher or lower.
Right.
And if you have supreme confidence in yourself, you size up the market, you have good teams, the probability of you taking, therefore, slightly more risks is actually to your benefit, because you're increasing your probability of staying in the game longer.
That's interesting. I mean, from a probability perspective, that makes a lot of sense. The more you spread yourself out, the more chances are that...
I don't mean that spread yourself out and defocus and completely diversify. But I think just...
But
when you're looking at options, and those could be 3 risks, as in 3 projects or products within a particular thing. It doesn't have to be 3 completely diverse businesses or 3
That's what I kind of meant.
Yes.
I meant when you're doing when you're running UTV, you have a number of different shows that you're working on. All
in
of
any
them
context,
have certain amounts of risks.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Okay, so I would like to end this chapter with a little bit around the end. So at the end of the chapter, each chapter you have some points that you bring out, right? So this is what you call entrepreneurship in a nutshell: action and reaction, understanding, confronting, and transcending fear, working, disrupting, and succeeding, trying and failing, and then laughing about it all later. What I'd like to do is talk about each of these things individually a little bit, right? So the first thing you talk about is action and reaction, right? What do you mean when you're saying action and reaction?
It's a little bit about accountability.
Right.
I mean, and consequence. You can't be an entrepreneur if you're not ready to face the consequences of your actions. And therefore, understanding that and reacting to that. And then there's a context of reacting, right? Because you need to actually take stock of what you've acted on. So I think it was much more in that context of saying accountability and consequence.
Do you think that is something that we don't see as much around, that people are kind of not?
I can't say you can't see it, because you won't be around if you don't face up to consequence.
But do you not think that accountability, that's in some ways people are not as accountable?
It can get hidden.
Okay.
It can get hidden, and then it surfaces all together in one big way, and then there's a big crash.
Okay.
So that's a dangerous part, which is why I said action, reaction.
Right. Okay. The next concept over here is understanding, confronting, and transcending fear. Right. So I think what you were talking about over there is basically just being able to move past the risks.
I think you have to move on. Yes,
Right.
absolutely. You have to take that setback and move on. You need to have that complete reservoir of confidence in yourself to be able to withstand that and move on.
Okay. The next one was working, disrupting, and succeeding. Right. So again, I think we're going to talk about disruption a lot more in the coming chapter.
Yeah.
But
because it's disrupting for the sake of disrupting means nothing.
Right.
You have to be able to get to that consequence of saying it is for the purpose of actually it's leading to something.
Right.
It's leading to some sense of success in some form or the other.
Okay. The next one we have is trying and failing, which I think is fairly self-explanatory.
It's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
You got to try stuff, and if
That's
it works, laughing about it all later.
That's very important.
Yeah.
That is very important. And the reason I'm saying that is not laughing as in haha laughing.
Right.
It's about introspection.
Okay.
And the point is that if you can distance yourself on something that was really cathartic for you 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year back, and be able to smile about it and laugh about it. It's like in anything else, it's in relationships. You may have bitter arguments, but then, when you make up, and then you can look at that and say, wow, but we kind of got to know each other better because of that temperament. So it is about it's very important to be able to laugh about it.
All right, great. I think that's a good place to end this episode, and we'll be back again next week to talk about the next one.
Sounds good. Failure and keep failing.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Bradman is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Advertising is dead. Yep, you heard me right. Advertising is dead. We're all in the content business now. Let's not call it news, TV, radio, etc., etc. It's all content, and we're in the middle of this weirdly exciting phase where all the borders and lines that have been drawn over decades has been swept away by this lovely thing called the internet. We're a show where we don't dwell on just the stuff that is now, but rather the wider stuff about advertising, media, content, and the whole goddamn circus surrounding it. Tune in every Tuesday for our weekly unboxing of the mystery box we used to call advertising. I'm Varun Dugirala, co-founder and content chief at The Glitch, and this is my new podcast, Advertising is Dead.